The Princess and the Goblin. Chapter 16. The Ring. The same moment her nurse came into the room, sobbing. When she saw her sitting there, she started back with a loud cry of amazement and joy. Then running to her, she caught her up in her arms and covered her dear little face with kisses. "My precious darling princess, where have you been? What has happened to you? We've all been crying our eyes out and searching the house from top to bottom for you." Not quite from the top, thought Irene to herself, and she might have added, not quite to the bottom, perhaps if she had known all. But the one she would not, and the other she could not say. "Oh, Ludi, I've had such a dreadful adventure," she replied, and told her all about the cat with the long legs, and how she ran out upon the mountain and came back again, but she said nothing of her grandmother or her lamp. "And there we've been searching for you all over the house for more than an hour and a half," exclaimed the nurse. "But that's no matter, now we've got you. Only, princess, I might say," she added, her mood changing, "what you ought to have done was to call your own Ludi to come and help you, instead of running out of the house and up the mountain in that wild, I must say, foolish fashion." "Well, Ludi," Irene said quietly, "perhaps if you had a big cat, all legs, running at you, you mightn't exactly know which was the wisest thing to do at the moment." "I wouldn't run up the mountain anyhow," returned Ludi. "Not if you had time to think about it, but when those creatures came at you that night on the mountain, you were so frightened yourself that you lost your way home." This put a stop to Ludi's reproaches. She had been on the point of saying that the long-legged cat must have been a twilight fancy of the princess's, but the memory of the horrors of that night and of the talking to which the king had given her in consequence prevented her from saying that which, after all, she did not half believe, having a strong suspicion that the cat was a goblin, for the fact was that she knew nothing of the difference between the goblins and their creatures. She counted them all just goblins. Without another word, she went and got some fresh tea and bread and butter for the princess. Before she returned, the whole household, headed by the housekeeper, burst into the nursery to exult over their darling. The gentlemen-at-arms followed, and were ready enough to believe all she told them about the long-legged cat. Indeed, though wise enough to say nothing about it, they remembered with no little horror just such a creature amongst those they had surprised at their gambols upon the princess's lawn. In their hearts they blamed themselves for not having kept better watch, and their captain gave order that from this night the front door and all the windows on the ground floor should be locked immediately the sun set, and opened after upon no pretense whatever. The men-at-arms redoubled their vigilance, and for some time there was no further cause of alarm. When the princess woke the next morning, her nurse was bending over her. "How your ring does glow this morning, princess! Just like a fiery rose," she said. "Does it, Ludi?" returned Irene. "Who gave me the ring, Ludi? I know I've had it a long time, but where did I get it? I don't remember." "I think it must have been your mother gave it to you, princess, but really, for as long as you have worn it, I don't remember that I ever heard," answered her nurse. "I will ask my King Papa the next time he comes," said Irene. Chapter 17. Springtime. The spring, so dear to all creatures young and old, came at last, and before the first few days of it had gone, the king rode through its budding valleys to see his little daughter. He had been in a distant part of the dominion all the winter, for he was not in the habit of stopping in one great city or of visiting only his favorite country houses, but he moved from place to place, that all his people might know him. Wherever he journeyed, he kept a constant lookout for the ablest and best men to put into office, and wherever he found himself mistaken, and those he had appointed incapable or unjust, he removed them at once. Hence, you see, it was his care of the people that kept him from seeing his princess so often as he would have liked. You may wonder why he did not take her with him, but there were several reasons against his doing so, and I suspect her great-great-grandmother had had a principal hand in preventing it. Once more Irene heard the bugle blast, and once more she was at the gate to meet her father as he rode up on his great white horse. After they had been alone for a little while, she thought of what she had resolved to ask him. "Please, King Papa," she said, "will you tell me where I got this pretty ring? I can't remember." The king looked at it. A strange, beautiful smile spread like sunshine over his face, and an answering smile, but at the same time a questioning one, spread like moonlight over Irene's. "It was your Queen Mamma's once," he said. "And why isn't it hers now?" asked Irene. "She does not want it now," said the king, looking grave. "Why doesn't she want it now?" "Because she's gone where all those rings are made." "And when shall I see her?" asked the princess. "Not for some time," answered the king, and the tears came in his eyes. Irene did not remember her mother, and did not know why her father looked so, and why the tears came in his eyes. But she put her arms round his neck and kissed him, and asked no more questions. The king was much disturbed on hearing the report of the gentlemen at arms concerning the creatures they had seen, and I presume would have taken Irene with him that very day, but for what the presence of the ring on her finger assured him of. About an hour before he left, Irene saw him go up the old stair, and he did not come down again till they were just ready to start, and she thought with herself that he had been up to see the old lady. When he went away, he left the other 6 gentlemen behind him, that there might be 6 of them always on guard. And now, in the lovely spring weather, Irene was on the mountain the greater part of the day. In the warmer hollows there were lovely primroses, and not so many that she ever got tired of them. As often as she saw a new one, opening an eye of light in the blind earth, she would clap her hands with gladness, and, unlike some children I know, instead of pulling it, would touch it as tenderly as if it had been a new baby, and having made its acquaintance, would leave it as happy as she found it. She treated the plants on which they grew like birds' nests. Every fresh flower was like a new little bird to her. She would pay a visit to all the flower nests she knew, remembering each by itself. She would go down on her hands and knees beside one and say, "Good morning. Are you smelling very sweet this morning?" "Goodbye." And then she would go to another nest and say the same. It was a favorite amusement with her. There were many flowers up and down, and she loved them all, but the primroses were her favorites. "They're not too shy, and they're not a bit forward," she would say to Ludi. There were goats too about over the mountain, and when the little kids came, she was as pleased with them as with the flowers. The goats belonged to the miners mostly, a few of them to Chpt's mother, but there were a good many wild ones that seemed to belong to nobody. These the goblins counted theirs, and it was upon them partly that they lived. They set snares and dug pits for them, and did not scruple to take when tame ones happened to be caught, but they did not try to steal them in any other manner, because they were afraid of the dogs the hill people kept to watch them, for the knowing dogs always tried to bite their feet. But the goblins had a kind of sheep of their own, very queer creatures, which they drove out to feed at night, and the other goblin creatures were wise enough to keep good watch over them, for they knew they should have their bones by and by. Chapter 18. Chpt's Clue. Chpt was as watchful as ever, but was almost getting tired of his ill success. Every other night or so, he followed the goblins about as they went on digging and boring, and getting as near them as he could, watched them from behind stones and rocks, but as yet he seemed no nearer finding out what they had in view. As at first, he always kept hold of the end of his string, while his pickaxe, left just outside the hole by which he entered the goblins' country from the mine, continued to serve as an anchor and hold fast the other end. The goblins, hearing no more noise in that quarter, had ceased to apprehend an immediate invasion and kept no watch. One night, after dodging about and listening till he was nearly falling asleep with weariness, he began to roll up his ball, for he had resolved to go home to bed. It was not long, however, before he began to feel bewildered. One after another he passed goblin houses, caves that is, occupied by goblin families, and at length was sure they were as many more than he had passed as he came. He had to use great caution to pass unseen, they lay so close together. Could his string have led him wrong? He still followed winding it, and still it led him into more thickly populated quarters until he became quite uneasy and indeed apprehensive. For although he was not afraid of the cobs, he was afraid of not finding his way out. But what could he do? It was of no use to sit down and wait for the morning. The morning made no difference here. It was all dark, and always dark, and if his string failed him, he was helpless. He might even arrive within a yard of the mine and never know it. Seeing he could do nothing better, he would at least find where the end of the string was, and if possible, how it had come to play him such a trick. He knew by the size of the ball that he was getting pretty near the last of it, when he began to feel a tugging and pulling at it. What could it mean? Turning a sharp corner, he thought he heard strange sounds. These grew as he went on, to a scuffling and growling and squeaking, and the noise increased until, turning a second sharp corner, he found himself in the midst of it, and the same moment tumbled over a wallowing mass, which he knew must be a knot of the cob's creatures. Before he could recover his feet, he had caught some great scratches on his face and several severe bites on his legs and arms. But as he scrambled to get up, his hand fell upon his pickaxe, and before the horrid beast could do him any serious harm, he was laying about with it right and left in the dark. The hideous cries which followed gave him the satisfaction of knowing that he had punished some of them pretty smartly for their rudeness, and by their scampering and their retreating howls, he perceived that he had routed them. He stood a little, weighing his battle-axe in his hand, as if it had been the most precious lump of metal, but indeed no lump of gold itself could have been so precious at that time as that common tool. Then untied the end of the string from it, put the ball in his pocket, and still stood thinking. It was clear that the cob's creatures had found his axe, had between them carried it off, and had so led him he knew not where. But for all his thinking he could not tell what he ought to do, until suddenly he became aware of a glimmer of light in the distance. Without a moment's hesitation he set out for it, as fast as the unknown and rugged way would permit. Yet again turning a corner, led by the dim light, he spied something quite new in his experience of the underground regions. A small irregular shape of something shining. Going up to it, he found it was a piece of mica or Muscovy glass, called sheep silver in Scotland, and the light flickering as if from a fire behind it. After trying in vain for some time to discover an entrance to the place where it was burning, he came at length to a small chamber to which an opening high in the wall revealed a glow beyond. To this opening he managed to scramble up, and then he saw a strange sight. Below sat a little group of goblins around the fire, the smoke of which vanished into the darkness far aloft. The sides of the cave were full of shining minerals, like those of the palace hall, and the company was evidently of a superior order, for everyone wore stones about head or arms or waist, shining dull, gorgeous colors in the light of the fire. Nor had Curdie looked long before he recognized the king himself, and found that he had made his way into the inner apartment of the royal family. He had never had such a good chance of hearing something. He crept through the hole as softly as he could, scrambled a good way down the wall toward them without attracting attention, and then sat down and listened. The king, evidently the queen, and probably the crown prince and the prime minister were talking together. He was sure of the queen by her shoes, for as she warmed her feet at the fire, he saw them quite plainly. "That will be fun," said the one he took for the crown prince. It was the first whole sentence he heard. I don't see why you should think it such a grand affair, said his stepmother, tossing her head backward. You must remember, my spouse, interposed his majesty, as if making excuse for his son. He has got the same blood in him. His mother— Don't talk to me of his mother. You positively encourage his unnatural fancies. Whatever belongs to that mother ought to be cut out of him. You forget yourself, my dear, said the king. I don't, said the queen, nor you either. If you expect me to approve of such coarse tastes, you will find yourself mistaken. I don't wear shoes for nothing. You must acknowledge, however, said the king, with a little groan, that this at least is no whim of Harelip's, but a matter of state policy. You are well aware that this gratification comes purely from the pleasure of sacrificing himself to the public good, does it not, Harelip? Yes, father, of course it does. Only it will be nice to make her cry. I'll have the skin taken off between her toes, and tie them up till they grow together. Then her feet will be like other people's, and there will be no occasion for her to wear shoes. Do you mean to insinuate I've got toes, you unnatural wretch? Cried the queen, and she moved angrily toward Harelip. The counselor, however, who was betwixt them, leaned forward so as to prevent her touching him, but only as if to address the prince. Your Royal Highness, he said, possibly requires to be reminded that you have got 3 toes yourself, 1 on one foot, 2 on the other. Ha ha ha! Shouted the queen triumphantly. The counselor, encouraged by this mark of favor, went on. It seems to me, Your Royal Highness, it would greatly endear you to your future people, proving to them that you are not the less one of themselves, that you had the misfortune to be born of a son mother. If you were to command upon yourself the comparatively slight operation, which in a more extended form you so unwisely meditate with regard to your future princess. Ha ha ha! Laughed the queen louder than before, and the king and the minister joined in the laugh. It was anything but a laughing matter to Harelip. He growled, and for a few moments the others continued to express their enjoyment at his discomfiture. The queen was the only one Curdie could see with any distinctness. She sat sideways to him, and the light of the fire shone full upon her face. He could not consider her handsome. Her nose was certainly broader at the end than its extreme length, and her eyes, instead of being horizontal, were set up like 2 perpendicular eggs, one on the broad and the other on the small end. Her mouth was no bigger than a small buttonhole until she laughed, when it stretched from ear to ear, only to be sure her ears were very nearly in the middle of her cheeks. Anxious to hear everything they might say, Curdie ventured to slide down a smooth part of the rock just under him to a projection below, upon which he thought to rest. But whether he was not careful enough, or the projection gave way, down he came with a rush on the floor of the cavern, bringing with him a great rumbling shower of stones. The goblins jumped from their seats in more anger than consternation, for they had never yet seen anything to be afraid of in the palace. But when they saw Curdie with his pick in his hand, their rage was mingled with fear, for they took him for the first of an invasion of miners. The king, notwithstanding, drew himself up to his full height of 4 feet, spread himself to his full breadth of 3½ for he was the handsomest and squarest of all the goblins, and strutting up to Curdie, planted himself with outspread feet before him, and said with dignity, "Pray, what right have you in my palace?" "The right of necessity, your majesty," answered Curdie. "I lost my way, and did not know where I was wandering to." "How did you get in?" "By a hole in the mountain." "But you are a miner. Look at your pickaxe." Curdie did look at it, answering, "I came upon it, lying on the ground, a little way from here. I tumbled over some wild beasts who were playing with it. Look, your majesty," and Curdie showed him how he was scratched and bitten. The king was pleased to find him behave more politely than he had expected from what his people had told him concerning the miners, for he attributed it to the power of his own presence. but he did not therefore feel friendly to the intruder. "You will oblige me by walking out of my dominions at once," he said, well knowing what a mockery lay in the words. "With pleasure, if your majesty will give me a guide," said Chpt. "I will give you 1,000, said the king, with a scoffing air of magnificent liberality. "One will be quite sufficient," said Chpt. But the king uttered a strange shout, half halloo, half roar, and in rushed goblins till the cave was swarming. He said something to the first of them which Chpt could not hear, and it was passed from one to another till in the moment the farthest in the crowd had evidently heard and understood it. They began to gather about him in a way he did not relish, and he retreated toward the wall. They pressed upon him. "Stand back," said Chpt, grasping his pickaxe tighter by his knee. They only grinned and pressed closer. Chpt bethought himself and began to rhyme. 10, 20, 30, you're all so very dirty. 20, 30, 40, you're all so thick and snorty. 30, 40, 50, you're all so puffed and snifty. 40, 50, 60, beast and man so mixty. 50, 60, 70, mixty, maxty, leventy. 60, 70, 80, all your cheeks so slaty. 70, 80, 90, all your hands so flinty. 80, 90, 100, all together 100. The goblins fell back a little when he began, and made horrid grimaces all through the rhyme, as if eating something so disagreeable that it set their teeth on edge and gave them the creeps. But whether it was that the rhyming words were most of them no words at all, for a new rhyme being considered efficacious, Chpt had made it on the spur of the moment, or whether it was that the presence of the king and the queen gave them courage, I cannot tell. But the moment the rhyme was over, they crowded on him again, and out shot 100 long arms, with a multitude of thick nailless fingers at the end of them, to lay hold upon him. Then Chpt heaved up his axe, but being as gentle and courageous as not wishing to kill any of them, he turned the end, which was square and blunt like a hammer, and with that came down a great blow on the head of the goblin nearest him. Hard as the heads of all goblins are, he thought he must feel that, and so he did, no doubt, but he only gave a horrible cry, and sprung at Chpt's throat. Chpt, however, drew back in time, and just at that critical moment remembered the vulnerable part of the goblin body. He made a sudden rush at the king, and stamped with all his might on his majesty's feet. The king gave a most unkingly howl, and almost fell into the fire. Chpt then rushed into the crowd, stamping right and left. The goblins drew back, howling on every side as he approached, but they were so crowded that few of those he attacked could escape his tread, and the shrieking and roaring that filled the cave would have appalled Chpt but for the good hope it gave him. They were tumbling over each other in heaps in their eagerness to rush from the cave, when a new assailant suddenly faced him. The queen, with flaming eyes and expanded nostrils, her hair standing half up from her head, rushed at him. She trusted in her shoes. They were of granite, hollowed like French sabots. Chpt would have endured much rather than hurt a woman, even if she was a goblin. But here was an affair of life and death. Forgetting her shoes, he made a great stamp on one of her feet, but she instantly returned it with a very different effect, causing him frightful pain and almost disabling him. His only chance with her would have been to attack the granite shoes with his pickaxe, but before he could think of that, she had caught him up in her arms and was rushing with him across the cave. She dashed him into a hole in the wall with a force that almost stunned him, but although he could not move, he was not too far gone to hear her great cry, and the rush of multitudes of soft feet followed by the sounds of something heaved up against the rock, after which a multitudinous patter of stones falling near him. The last had not ceased when he grew very faint, for his head had been badly cut and at last insensible. When he came to himself, there was perfect silence about him, and utter darkness, but for a merest glimmer in one tiny spot. He crawled to it, and found that they had heaved a slab against the mouth of the hole, past the edge of which a poor little gleam found its way from the fire. He could not move it a hair's breadth, for they had piled a great heap of stones against it. He crawled back to where he had been lying, in the faint hope of finding his pickaxe, but after a vain search, he was at last compelled to acknowledge himself in an evil plight. He sat down and tried to think, but soon fell fast asleep. End of chapter 18. Please go to the next clip for chapter 19.